Hi, I'm David MacDonald. I'm here with my Sound Notion co-host Sam Merciers to host a discussion about substitute musician pay in the Minnesota Orchestra. We're joined by two experts on the topic who've been writing a lot about the issue quite a bit lately. Robert Levine is the principal violist of the Milwaukee Symphony. He blogs at polyphonic.org, and Drew McManus is an orchestra business consultant who blogs at adaptistration.com. Thank you guys for joining us this morning.
Nice to
Thanks
be
for
here.
having us.
For anybody that has not been following the Minnesota Orchestra over the last few years, I want to first briefly explain what it is that we're here talking about. So the Minnesota Orchestra was in a lockout for about a year and a half, and at the very end of 2013, beginning of 2014, the lockout ended, the musicians came back, there was a new collective bargaining agreement, and the musicians got a lot of things that they wanted. They got the CEO, Michael Henson, outed. They got the music director, Osma Vanska, who had left the orchestra in the middle of this dispute. They got him to come back, and they obviously got to start playing again. But one of the concessions that they made was a change in the way that substitute musicians were paid on the per-service schedule. So if you're a full-time musician in the orchestra, a regular musician in the orchestra, and you were getting paid on the per-service rate, you were getting one rate, and if you were a part-time musician, a sub in the orchestra, you were getting 90% of that. So you were getting 10% less than the regular sub rate. Is that accurate? Anybody? I'm going to. You have a correction?
I mean,
Okay.
it's leaving. I think the one thing I would quibble is that the musicians in the Minnesota made a lot of concessions. I mean, that was not a settlement that anybody would have found attractive. Its merit was basically that it was a lot better than what management had started with 14 months before, which was truly awful.
Okay. Well, I think we probably expect that an initial offer in this kind of thing, in the limited experience that I have looking at this stuff, is going to have a lot of things in it that are not going to be in the final collective bargaining agreement. So when this whole thing started, when Drew, you wrote about some of the best and worst stories of 2014, and you put this at the top of your worst list. Why was this so bad, and why was it so much worse than the other things on your list?
Well, you're right in that the statement before about the initial offer from management with substitute pay disparity, which is that gap between what substitutes are paid versus an equal pay for equal work level to the full-time musicians. The initial offer was 75% of what a full-time musician is paid on a per-service level. And that did come up to 90%, but still not parity, which I think we're going to be talking about. But as far as the worst of elements is, you had a situation which I think you've described well, which is the musicians were hammered quite hard by their management. I think it's seen rather universally that it was a thoroughly unnecessary lockout, certainly for the length of time. And it was made far more vitriolic than it needed to be based on a lot of, let's call, perhaps philosophical-driven ideals. So by the time it was settled, I think it's certainly a fair rationale to think that the musicians really accepted the disparity because there was no other way to get back to work after such a long break. The point where I start to pick that up is if that's the case, and I think it is a reasonable thing to assume, is then the musicians now have the capability of being able to rectify that disparity on their own for the length of the contract until they're able to renegotiate it back in with what I call a disparity mitigation fund, which, for lack of a better term, is something that the musicians can either contribute to directly, they can hold fundraisers, they can follow whatever course of action they want to, but then be able to collect that difference between what the substitutes should be making to get them back up to parity, and then distribute that to them so that there is equal pay for equal work during the length of this concessionary agreement.
So, Robert, I wanna hear from you, and so you seemed to, in what you had said just now and what you've written on your blog, seemed to not think of this as quite as severe a thing as Drew seems to think it is. Can you explain?
Well, I'm not sure that's quite true.
Okay.
I certainly didn't like it at all, and I've written on a number of occasions in the past about these kinds of disparities and how unfair they are. And there's no question that this was unfair to subs, but it was unfair to everybody. It was unfair to the orchestra to have been locked out for 14 months over a dispute that was really, in many ways, ideologically driven. It's important to remember the Minnesota Orchestra was really one of, for decades, was one of the strongest and best run orchestras in the country. I played in St. Paul for 8 years back in the 80s, and we always used to look across the river with envy at the kind of management and board they had. And in fact, things were going pretty well for a long time. They had a wonderful music director. Then they had, a change in board leadership, a change in staff leadership. It really seemed to have one of their priorities was not only running the institution, but running it in a certain way. And there's no question from the nature of the settlement, from the negotiation, from what they've said afterwards, that the so-called new model was really a very important part of what they were trying to get. So my point in the end was that this was not a good thing that happened. Although there were obviously costs to the subs for the orchestra being out of work for 14 months too. But that in the end it wasn't the musicians' fault, and it's not the kind of thing the musicians can really rectify, nor should they be responsible for rectifying it because they didn't cause it. And the rectification essentially involves them making even less than they are now.
So you say that they didn't cause it, but they did agree to the collective bargaining agreement, right? They have agreed to this thing as a unit, and that is something that I think they do you not think that they're responsible for that concession?
Well, responsibility in a negotiation is, it's one thing to say both sides have to sign it, and that's true. But if someone comes up to you with a gun and demands your money, you have not exactly agreed to hand it over, even though you may have done it without being shot. There's no question in my mind, from watching from the outside, from having been in a situation a little like this, actually several, and from talking to people on the ground there, that this was not something they wanted to do. This was something in the end they felt that they were really compelled to do in order to get a settlement at all at a time when the continued existence of the institution was being called into serious question. I think the board acted very irresponsibly here by making this the kind of bottom line issue that they did. But they did. The musicians didn't. The fact that they agreed to it does not really mean they were responsible for it.
Well, do you think this is the sort of thing where the board and the executives are just looking to win in some way, and if that's their primary concern, is that this has just become kind of a symbol of things that they don't like, and they don't like unions, and they wish they were in a right to work state or something, and they just want to win on this point?
It's very hard to know from the outside what is driving a particular position, especially when it's held that deeply. it's funny because paying subs 10% less actually saves, on an overall institutional budget basis, a trivial amount of money. If you tie it into the fact that they've also reduced the size of the orchestra, it begins to look a little more rational as a business model.
I would also say that it incentivizes them to shrink the orchestra even
well,
further. Every
yeah.
person they can cut, that's another 10% of their salary that they can get rid of.
Well, it's a lot more than that, because of course subs are not making health insurance. They don't have a guarantee of services. Subs, can be quite remarkably cheaper than full-time musicians, even if you're paying them at what we call parity, which to my mind is probably not parity anyway.
Well, I'm an adjunct professor. I'm fully aware of this phenomenon.
But so, it's hard to know why the board was so married to this proposal, but pretty clearly from the outside, they were married to it. And those things can be, major obstacles to a settlement if the other side at the end is not willing to give in.
I have a question. It's related to reducing the overall size of the orchestra, as that relates to reducing the pay of substitute or fill-in musicians. Certainly, the side of the musicians in this kind of situation. However, we've covered Notion podcast. We started when we pretty much started the same time Detroit started having their issues. The rhetoric from the musician side invariably is, we have to pay this much money because we need to maintain our status as a top-tier orchestra. Without this money, we can't do that. That's always, in every one of these situations that I've read about, that's a stance that the musicians or those who represent the musicians take. Doesn't it seem like that rhetoric kind of falls flat when, in their negotiation, they're willing to take a reduction in overall personnel, which means to mount big pieces, the kind that, for instance, a top-tier orchestra might want to do, to mount a Mahler 9 or whatever, they have to hire a bunch of musicians and pay those musicians less, thus sort of undercutting the argument that to maintain our top-tier status, we have to pay the musicians what they're worth.
Personally, I think that's a very good point, and it certainly ends up demonstrating how this issue can tend to snowball. And I think it's that dynamic consequence that makes this particular discussion, meaning the Minnesota pay disparity. Because to be very clear, they're not the only orchestra that engages a pay disparity with substitutes. In fact, a majority of ICSOM orchestras have engaged a pay disparity within the last 10 years. And I think those are very genuine questions of sincerity, of where does that line fall? And if it is a line, is it adjustable? Is it flexible? And when I was writing about this, when David mentioned the best and worst of 2014, this is being written about, and I look at this as it impacts the field as an issue of equal work for equal pay is not one of those flexible items. It either exists or it doesn't exist. And if you think it's flexible, then you end up in this never-ending Sophie's choice. There's always something you have to discard to be able to get what you want out of something. And a discussion becomes dominated by self-interest over a larger mission-driven purpose of a nonprofit.
Well, that point that you mentioned, the self-interest versus the good of the institution, seems to me to be the whole point of a union, is that the union is together either succeeding or not succeeding, or reaching a level or not reaching that level. And to me, it seems contrary to the purpose of having a union to allow for some musicians to be paid less for doing the same amount of work.
There's a representation element there, I think, is probably fair for those listening who may not understand how this works, because I don't think we've talked about it yet, is within a collective bargaining agreement at a professional symphony orchestra, the full-time musicians are the ones allowed to negotiate on their own behalf and conduct a ratification vote. The substitute musicians are not included in that process on the representation level, meaning that the full-time musicians are entrusted as the stewards of their trust. They're the ones that they believe are going to act in their interest as well as their own interest as full-time musicians.
Well, let me take a whack at a few of the questions that have been raised here. As regards to rhetoric, yes, to some extent what you're saying is true, but rhetoric in a negotiation, you see that from both sides. You saw the rhetoric from the Minnesota Orchestra management back in September of 2012, that if they didn't get exactly what they wanted, the institution was, essentially headed, down the drain. Mm-hmm. And pretty clearly they didn't get what they wanted, and they seem to be doing okay. Yes, the issue of orchestra size versus using subs, especially lower paid subs, it is an artistic issue, no question. We are fortunate in many situations, Milwaukee is one, that we have very good subs locally. That doesn't make it more fair. It makes it more sustainable, at least over the short term. Nobody pretends it's optimum either to pay subs less or use so many. I mean, you'd really like to have what Berlin has, or Chicago, or Vienna, where you've got over 100 people on full-time staff who are well paid, and you can select them on that basis at national or international auditions. The representation piece is interesting. What Drew is saying is mostly correct. The local union is technically the bargaining agent. The AFM, very much to its credit over the years, has devolved the lead role in negotiations to the orchestra committee. That doesn't mean the local is not at the table. I'm in an interesting situation because I'm our local president as well, and we sit at the table and we're very vocal on behalf of the interests of subs. At the end of the day, though, it's the members of the orchestra that ratify the agreement, again, by AFM bylaw, and in union democracy terms, very much to the AFM's credit. It is true that the subs are not directly involved in that process, and I think that is a major issue that I've also written about. It's not an easy one to solve. There are a couple of orchestras, and the Met Opera is probably the best example, where they actually have a number of bargaining units in the company represented by the AFM local. They have a lot of experience in making that work. It would certainly be an interesting venture for an orchestra like mine or Minnesota to involve the subs, especially in a difficult negotiation, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. And it is, if there's an unfairness here, that's probably the single biggest one, that the subs really don't get to choose representation, don't really have enough of a voice in this process.
Well, what really is then the appropriate level of a voice for a sub musician? I think that's an interesting concern. I'm not sure that it makes sense to have every sub have an equal say as the full-time musicians. Maybe it does. But for people that are playing every concert all season long, and people that are coming in only when they're doing, a giant Mahler symphony, to have the same role seems strange to me. Though maybe there's a good reason to have it that way. Robert, what do you think is the best role for subs in the negotiation? How could we solve that?
I think you put your finger on one of the issues, which is that some subs work an awful lot with an orchestra and are essentially what we would call a first call roster, and others come in very occasionally. And there's no question in an orchestral negotiation that the people that have the most at stake are the full-time musicians. It's really, as in Minnesota, it was their economic lives that were at stake. The subs obviously had a lot at stake too, but the people in the Minnesota Orchestra, they were getting murdered. They even when they were able to pick up alternate work, it didn't begin to cover the income that they lost. They have the most at stake. That's not to say that other people shouldn't have, that the subs shouldn't be involved. Now, the other interesting thing here is, of course, that in many, many issues, especially working conditions, the interests of the subs and the full-time musicians are essentially identical. Subs don't want to work 3 or 4 services a day any more than the full-time musicians. It's the compensation piece that gets hard, and one of the reasons it's hard, as I've written, is that equal pay for equal work is not a concept that's quite as simple as taking 1/8 of a weekly salary and saying that's your per service rate and that's fair. I think there's a good argument to be made that truly equal pay for equal work would mean that the per service rate for subs could end up being a lot higher to compensate them for not having health insurance, to compensate them for not having the kind of job security that full-time musicians have. The flip side of that, and it's also a fair point, is to say that even 90% of what the Minnesota Orchestra is making on a per-service basis probably makes it the best gig between Chicago and Seattle.
Yeah.
Chicago, it's probably the best gig in the Twin Cities. That also does not make it fair. And in the long term, it's not wise either, I don't think. But, it's not. There are black and white aspects to this, but, you can't look at it just in isolation.
Sure, I mean it's a complex issue, and that's why we wanted to have this conversation, because it has a lot of moving parts, and like you said, there are a lot of reasons why it might make sense for a person to be full-time or part-time, and there are other musicians that are kind of part-time technically, but de facto full-time, and there are all those other considerations aside from just their direct pay, all of the benefits, and a lot of other concerns go into that. And so, Drew, you mentioned this a little bit a moment ago, your proposal for the mitigation fund, where there would be some system for giving those musicians that extra 10% in Minnesota that they're losing. You want to maybe explain that?
Sure. I think what Robert was talking about, though, with this being not necessarily a black and white issue and one that isn't concrete, is one that I would take a good bit of issue with, or that this issue isn't one to separate out. Where the question you had presented to Robert before about the level of vested interest that a substitute can have in an ensemble is flexible because of the type of subs that they hire. I think that's an excellent point and a good way to look at this, because it helps justify the rationale for equal pay for equal work. It doesn't matter what level that sub's engagement is with the organization, they all know they're going to have that fixed level of equal pay for equal work. And now if you want to have a discussion past that point of then what qualifies exactly as equal pay for equal work that Robert's brought up, I think that's an equally superb conversation to have. But a good place to start that works across the board and can be applied to all professional orchestras, not just Minnesota, even those that work on purely per service levels for the rostered full-time musicians, is going to be that service count. And in that case, that service count of 100% pay per service for a substitute for what the full-time musicians make is where you need to go.
I basically agree with that. I mean, that is, I think, the minimum that would be considered equitable. I'm not sure it's enough, but anything below that Anything below that really does not strike me as fair, or in most cases, economically justified.
Well, and in that case, it gets now back to David's question of the mitigation fund that I proposed. Is where is this disconnect between the final agreement that has that 10% disparity gap for substitute musicians? Why then is it not justifiable for the Minnesota Orchestra musicians to fill that gap on their own until they get to their next collective bargaining negotiation, if it's something that they had absolutely no desire to accept, but felt they had to after such a painful series of unjustified rationale behind the lockout? There's nothing that prevents them from doing it. There's nothing that will damage their position in the future. And if anything, on a much larger national scale on this issue, they're able to take what would have been, I think everyone agrees, is a horrible situation and pull out a unique silver lining because it puts them in a real role of leadership by being able to move forward not just with rhetoric, but action.
Well, so, go ahead, Robert.
No, go ahead.
No, if you want to respond, go right ahead.
I think the answer to that is, and it sounds a little harsh, but it's both philosophical and practical, which is, why is that the musician's responsibility? They didn't propose it. They didn't want it. From what I've heard, they fought as hard as they could against it.
They're responsible for it.
No, they're not. You see, I don't believe they are, and that's the difference. The fact is, you know, they signed that agreement under duress.
Sure.
The people that are responsible for it may not even be there anymore, but you know, if they are, they're on the management and the board side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the practical problems are these. Fundamentally, I think it does have long-term ramifications. I don't think it's in musicians' interest to turn themselves into a piggy bank for management any more than they already are. You know, we want to encourage management to fix these problems. We don't want to discourage them by essentially fixing them ourselves. Now, in more practical terms, as I said, the musicians in the Minnesota Orchestra took a massive financial hit. I'm sure there are people in that orchestra that went through most of their retirement savings, that went through most of their college savings. You know, I've got friends up there. I know people that they were couples in that orchestra. I mean, you know, it was hard for us when we took when we take a 10 or 15% pay cut, which we've done on occasion in Milwaukee, without a work stoppage. I mean, to do that as they did after a year and a half of not only not making any income but not having health insurance, that's a lot to ask. And as you pointed out in, I think, Jacksonville, where the local did it, that's a very interesting idea, and you know, it's not necessarily one that would be out of the question in all situations, although I think it raises the same piggy bank issue. But you have to remember that the Twin Cities local, 3073, was equally devastated because not only was Minnesota Orchestra locked out, their other major bargaining unit, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, was locked out for the same time. If they had reserves before those two lockouts, I'm pretty sure they don't anymore. I know at the AFM convention last summer, we raised $75,000 for the local, just so that the local could survive. You know, at the end of the day, it's not the musician's responsibility or the locals to pay the subs. That's the employer's responsibility, and that's the problem I have with the scheme you're proposing, although, you know, it does have a certain attractive aspect.
Is it possible, Robert, for the musicians to take responsibility for this level of unfairness, even if they are not themselves the cause of it or to blame for it, but to take responsibility for supporting the other members of the union? And isn't that why we have a union, so that we support one another in ways just like this?
Well, yes, and I think they did. As Drew pointed out, I haven't heard the exact figure. Uh, what the subs ended up with was a lot better than what management was proposing. And that is fundamentally where you support your colleagues. You do it at the table. And I'm sure that they will in the future, although from experience here in Milwaukee, I can tell them that they have an uphill battle. It's a hard thing to get out once management succeeded in getting it in. But that, I think, is the appropriate way to go forward. And maybe, for the local and the musicians to do what I think all locals and all full-time musicians ought to do, which is to find a way to bring them formally into the process so that they have a voice and they have some say over their own fates, because that's what full-time musicians fought for years about. That's what ICSOM started over back in the 60s. And it seems to me only fair that the part-time musicians in our field, and without whom our field would not operate, have that same right.
Well, and I think you're touching on something here that is it seems maybe a little trivial to put this way, but I think very important, is that it just feels weird and wrong for the orchestra not to pay these people what they're clearly worth, and for the orchestra to essentially pay themselves and find this money some other way. It seems just strange.
Except I don't think that's what happened here. That was, I don't think.
I'm talking about Drew's proposal. Feels weird for the orchestra to just pay themselves instead of the orchestra paying them, or the management to pay them, for the musicians to find some way to pay themselves. It does feel weird, right, Drew?
It's certainly unusual, right? This is why this particular situation is unique, because here you have something that I think is a universal understanding that the lockout was caused by a mentality and a small cadre of their leadership that is now all out of the organization. And because of that, you ended up with a byproduct that nobody is happy with, nobody is satisfied with, and clearly has a level of unjustified and unequal application. Robert's point of it's not the musician's job to pay for something that is the employer's position would make a lot of sense in most other cases, especially ones where you have disparities set up where musicians have been getting raises regularly, but the substitutes still are paid less. But in this particular situation, this is where you have that responsibility element that comes in. Because Robert's talking about something that I wholeheartedly agree with, which is that representation element for substitutes. That is something that I think the AFM needs to have a very serious conversation about. But in the meantime, presenting the disparity in Minnesota as the musicians shouldn't be paying for management's mistakes except substitutes, or unless you're a substitute, then it's okay to have them pay for management's mistakes. It's ultimately that representation element. You had people raise money within the AFM for their local, other orchestras raise money for the full-time musicians, but now when it comes time to potentially raising money to help the substitutes who ended up with an even rawer end of the deal, all of a sudden it's, well, no, the buck passes on to someone else. And that's where, if they want, and by they I mean musicians, professional orchestra musicians in general, if they want to send a real message and take a leadership role by leading with action over just rhetoric, saying they don't like something, this is the way to go about doing
it.
Go ahead, Robert.
It's a fair point, but I think that characterization is a little unfair. My orchestra sent money to Minnesota, as did many others. I don't know precisely how that money was used. I know a lot of it was used to put on concerts, and those concerts all involved subs. I know because I was one of them. So it's not just the full-time musicians that were benefiting from that. And it actually wasn't individual musicians that were helping the local. It was other locals that were helping the local. And it was the first time in AFM history that it ever happened. And of course, it is the local's responsibility and job to represent the subs. And they did that, I think, to the best of their ability in the situation. Would it be inspiring to see the musicians do this? In some ways, yes. Do I expect them to? Do I think it's reasonable to expect them to? No. If you wanted to look at a situation where that would really be, in my mind, justified in inspiration, you look at those orchestras that did, as Drew said, essentially get raises on the backs of subs. And there have been a couple. I don't particularly want to name names because I've already done that. But they have, to my mind, they've got some sins to atone for. And this would be a good way to do this. I don't think the people in Minnesota on the orchestra side have any sins to atone for at all.
Well, and to me, the big question is if we're going to make up this 10% some way, where is that money going to come from? And the two options that Drew proposed are from the union, who's going to pay for it from the other fees that they collect from the other union members, or from the musicians organization that was established during the collective bargaining agreement. It's a new nonprofit just supporting the musicians. And I think the union one feels strange because they're the ones that are supposed to be getting paid from the orchestra, and the nonprofit organization one feels strange because it divides now the donor base for an orchestra, and people are going to now have to either decide to donate to either the orchestra or this other thing, and it I don't know, that seems really like that could get really messy.
That's the very same potential competitive situation that any nonprofit goes against in their own local community. When the orchestra,
but this is one organization. This is one organization competing against itself. From the perspective of the audience, I don't think that there is quite as big a gap between the organization of the orchestra and the organization of the musicians of the orchestra.
That's another really fascinating point to talk about when musicians form their own nonprofit organization in conjunction with their players association, which is part of the union. There's all kinds of overlap there that can be discussed about how that works and what they do with that nonprofit organization. But that larger element of where that money comes from is the disparity is there. If you ultimately believe that equal pay for equal work is something that's not a flexible item, if it's something that is a basic element of absolute fairness, that one person's work is worth exactly what another person's work is for equal responsibility, then the money has to come from somewhere. If you have a situation that's forced on you, like it is in Minnesota, where they have this disparity, then yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have about where that money is going to come from, but it's going to have to come from somewhere. Because the element that hasn't been talked about in all of this is still this larger national perspective. Where is this going to go? From a union perspective, looking at the message that they're sending to a generation of substitute players is, you've got the raw end of the deal. You should still be grateful because it's still the higher paying job in the area. But what happens when those subs become full-time musicians? They've now been trained to acquiesce, to be grateful for whatever's being forced on them, even if they don't think it's fair. That's also going to be a dynamic problem to work with down the road. Missing the opportunity here in Minnesota, with it being such a unique element of oppression, to be able to build the sort of solidarity that's going to help keep the field stable down the road and prevent other board and executive leadership from believing that if we push hard enough, we can get this disparity concession, and if we can just move our musicians over that line, they'll even justify it to some degree. Now's the time to do that.
Well, actually, I think the problem for the field is, yes, what Drew's saying is part of that. The other issue is the issue of orchestra size. That it's clearly not in the interest of full-time musicians, nor, I think, of the field as a whole, to move towards a more per-service model, which, of course, is what you're doing by both reducing the size of the orchestra and reducing subpay. We've seen that here in Milwaukee, where we last year we shed about 10 people, entirely through attrition and retirements. But we're down to a level where we simply cannot play any concerts without subsidy. That's not an ideal place to be artistically, although the orchestra is playing very well because we have good subs, we have good full-time musicians, we have a wonderful music director. But no one pretends to talk to them. It's not a good place to encourage boards and managements to go, because unless you really believe that you can put together a per-service orchestra that plays as well as Vienna or Berlin, you're going to make compromises by doing that. So, no, we definitely don't want to encourage this over the long term, and I think the issue that Drew was raising is how you disincentivize this and at the same time encourage managements to really think more long-term artistically is a very significant.
Robert, I have a quibble with you about the way you keep voicing the situation, where on the one hand you want to be very altruistic and put forth the idea that yes, this is the right thing to do, but then in your blog, that's sort of a response to Drew talking about the situation, you basically say, yes, we should be altruistic about it, but the situation was so bad in Minnesota that at that point they can stop being altruistic about it. And I also don't understand the big difference between, quote, getting a raise or taking less of a pay cut. How is that a huge difference for, if the orchestra is having to restructure itself financially and the musicians are taking a pay cut, taking less of a pay cut is the same as getting a raise in that context, especially when the way you want to start the discussion is from this altruistic point of view.
Well, I'm not, altruism is one of those loaded words. Orchestras are not charities. And this is not fundamentally about income redistribution. I do view the situation of an orchestra that is getting a good settlement and tries to get a better one on the back of subs very differently from a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint, than I do a situation like in Minnesota, where the musicians were essentially backed into a wall and told to, give up 10% of subpay, or they weren't going to have an orchestra. Those are two very different places ethically. And that's one of the reasons I fault those orchestras in the first situation and not the ones in the second. I don't know if that answers your question.
There's something I'd like to add there, and I think that's a good point that you brought up, Sam, because we talked a little before about the actual dollar amount that goes into this, and some of Robert's points were that the musicians had suffered a great deal of hardship by being out of work, and the actual amount of money that could go into something like a disparity fund would be more than what they should have to bear. And based on the numbers that are available right now, I've gone through the calculations, and at least during the first year of the agreement, you'd be looking at about anywhere between a 2.2 to 2.5% of a full-time musician's annual pay would have to go into a substitute disparity fund. The remaining years of the agreement, it would go down in every year, assuming the orchestra hired the full-time musicians that it's supposed to in each one of those years. But I think the money aspect does become important, because when the settlement was finally reached, when the musicians made their initial statement, the number one point that they made that was their line in the sand was that they needed to remain in the top 10 highest paid base salary threshold for professional orchestras. So from that aspect, it was about money. It's an ugly discussion to have, but it was clearly one of the elements which was fundamental. So if on one hand it was a success, even though a concessionary agreement, but a success that they remained in the top 10 highest paid, then it's also fair to look at that, is the 2.5% for 1 year and then less each following year too much to ask for putting into a disparity fund?
Yes.
Well, rhetoric is rhetoric. I guess I've been part of too much of it, and I've seen too much of it from management to take it terribly seriously one way or the other. I think the musicians were, they were spinning to some extent, just like management was. No question that being in the top tier of pay was an important issue for them. If you're saying in the end, would the musicians afford another 2.5%, if there could even be a mechanism to construct it to do that, which would not be a non-trivial problem, by the way. Well, you can always afford, anybody can afford another 2.5%, and that's why I end up going back to the question of why is it the musician's responsibility to do this? I haven't had access to the figures that Drew does. On my own orchestra, I know that, when we cut subpay, we saved institutionally what amounted to a trivial amount of money. That's what really bothers me about these proposals to management. The savings is simply not worth the angst and the distress and the tension that it causes. I don't know why management's pushed this, except that it's an ideological thing that somehow subs should make less. And, obviously I don't accept that. But that's one of the reasons I don't really think it is the musician's responsibility to solve this problem, except by pushing at the table the next time to get it fixed. And
well, we talked about those.
and as I said, hopefully figuring out a way to involve the subs and the extras more in the process. But as I said also, that is not an onus on the Minnesota Orchestra alone. I think that's an onus on musicians in this field as a whole.
Well, and that's one thing that we did, as you say, discuss earlier is how involved or not involved subs are in the negotiation process. And the thing that strikes me about putting this mitigation at the feet of the union is that it gives the local, if you give the local that responsibility, that is an added incentive for them to involve those subs in the negotiation in some way and to get those subs up to the same level of pay as the full-time musicians, because the closer they get to the full-time musician, the lower that mitigation is going to have to be, the less that they're going to have to be responsible for paying. So it seems that there's an extra incentive that is built into this some kind of mitigation system that is missing right now from the negotiation process.
Yeah, but
that's an excellent point.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, and there's one thing I think that's missing from this larger conversation that does add to the element of even why I think we're having the conversation, which is when I've been writing about this at Adaptistration, the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics is very important to me. And one of the elements that's contained within that code is that in order to really write about something in a fair and meaningful way, you need to present questions to those people that you're writing about or the institutions you're writing about. If you have a question, you have to ask the question. And my request for information, my requests for documentation to both the musicians and the management on this side have both been replied to with silence. The only actual acknowledgement I've received was I did contact the Minneapolis local, and they did confirm that they passed on my request and my questions to the local president. And the employer, the Minnesota Orchestra Association, acknowledged my requests for information and then promptly said, no, we're not going to give it to you. And the musicians have, other than an auto response that they've sent from an email, haven't responded to any questions at all. It's that lack of engagement that also puts a very unusual perspective on this. It's as though there's a reticence to even want to talk about it, and an embracing of an idea of let's just wait until the next negotiation, then we'll deal about it then. And otherwise, right now, we'll just be quiet.
Well, and I think that's something we see all the time in these discussions, is that we are hearing about all of these things for the first time when it comes up in the CBA negotiations, right? That we don't like talking about money, and then we kind of lift that taboo a little bit for however long it takes to negotiate the CBA, and then it's back again, right? And we don't think about the musicians organization at all separate from the management of the orchestra, except for during the negotiations. We kind of think of them as separately for a few months, or hopefully not a year and a half, and then it's back again, right? And then everybody's all together and it's the same thing. Everybody's happy and whatever. And it's interesting that the musicians in the orchestra seem to play the same game as well, right? They're like, oh, we're all just here making music, except for the however long it takes them to yell at each other in the newspaper.
Well, there are practical reasons for that. Even in a state like Minnesota, which is
where they're all very nice because they're Minnesotans.
They're nice, at least. I've been there. We won't get into Minnesota nice. I lived there for 8 years, and I love the place. But Minnesota nice is a construct, shall we say? But it is a remarkably pro-labor place. The Democratic Party up there is the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, and the Republicans are the Progressive Republican. But even in a state like that, much less a state like Georgia, anytime you start talking about labor negotiations, you're waving a red flag in front of a significant portion of the population. It's axiomatic that as soon as you start talking about negotiations in the press, the comments threads get filled with people saying they're making how much for banging a drum? Even in places like San Francisco, you think they know this. It's not fundamentally in either management or the musicians' interests to have discussion about these negotiations in the press. And nobody really. If long term, you'd like to see a little settlement bulletin in the paper, kind of at the bottom of page 8. There was an early settlement for 3 years. Boom, the end. That's all we would like people to know, because anything beyond that upsets some people. So there are practical reasons, I think, to go dark in between negotiations to the extent possible.
Yeah, and I think it's a similar thing to the when professional athletes are on strike, right? People look at these people who they see as very comfortable, very specialized workers, not like Teamsters or auto workers, and they say, well, you wear a tuxedo to work, you're clearly not a union person, or you make, as a pro athlete, $7 million last year. What are you? You don't need a union. You've got 3 houses, and I think that's to me like a separate conversation. But it does touch on this in that way, is that it's difficult to have these conversations for most of the year. So I think we've kind of wrapped up all of the big issues here. Do you Robert want to or Drew want to say anything in closing here?
Drew?
No, I was just going to say you can jump in first if you like. I started, I think, with the conversation.
Well, I don't think I have anything to add to what I've said. It was, it was a very unfortunate situation in the end, and as I said, I don't think anyone on the musician side or the union side was happy with the outcome, especially with regards to this issue. Um, that doesn't make it their responsibility to fix in the end and for the long term.
I agree with all of that. I think the entire situation was, I think, to put it politely, unfortunate. It was a real travesty, and it was one of the worst things that has happened in this field in probably anyone's memory or in history that they can go back to. And it's these missed moments that we're in right now of being able to take something that is fundamental as equal pay for equal work and chalk it up to, well, it was a bad situation, as though that's rationale for moving forward when there are alternatives that are available. Those alternatives will also, I think, help contribute to the discussions that Robert is encouraging, which I would love to see happen inside the AFM. I think it'd be good for the entire field, because the more consistency the AFM builds in that area, the easier it is to create the parameters under which board executives and administrative executives have to govern their orchestras. There's less question, and there's less time wasted. So we're still missing all of that at this point, and I think the opportunity exists. It's not entirely gone, but it is slipping away quickly. And the lack of engagement by the people who will ultimately be responsible for potentially implementing something like a disparity fund, that continued silence certainly isn't contributing to a solution in the problem right now.
If I could just add, when Drew says the AFM, I think technically he's right, but we have to remember that, again, to its credit, the AFM is one of the most democratic unions in the American labor movement, and the real minds and hearts that have to be won here over the long term in terms of justice for extras are those of the full-time musicians. They have to see it's an issue. They have to believe, I think, in a way that not all of us do yet, that this is a moral issue, and we need to fix it.
And I'm glad to see conversations like this where we can actually talk about this, where before it's something that never really rises to the level of attention for traditional media.
Yes.
Well, and Drew, I think you're absolutely right that we don't talk about this enough, and we don't train musicians to think about these things, much less understand them and implement the strategies to convince people and convince orchestra management that they are worth whatever it is that they're asking for. And hopefully conversations like this can help young musicians start to think about those things, because it's certainly nothing that I talked about when I was in school, and I would imagine that's the case for everyone else on the panel as well. So I want to thank you both for being a part of this conversation. It's been a great time.
Thank you, guys. It's been great to have the venue to be able to do this.
Very good.
I'm glad that we did this. So if you're watching or listening to this, thank you so much for doing so. You can find out more about what Sam and I do at soundnotion.tv. You can find Drew's writing at adaptistration.com. He's on Twitter at @adaptistration, and Robert is at polyphonic.org, and polyphonic.org is on Twitter as well. Thank you guys so much for joining us this week, and we should do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Guys. Take care.